I never imagined that I would find myself in this situation again. Yet, here I was, about to let my ex-husband stay in my house. The familiar chill that came with the thought of having Lucas under my roof crept up my spine, but there I was, standing at the edge of my own guilt. It was only supposed to be temporary. Just a few nights. A favor, nothing more. I had moved on. At least, that's what I told myself. I had a beautiful life now. A life with Daniel, my new husband, someone who was everything Lucas wasn't. He was caring, attentive, and emotionally available. We had built a life together, one I believed was stronger than any ghost of my past. But Lucas? Well, Lucas was still a part of my past that I had never truly managed to bury. I had been divorced from him for 2 years now, and the break had been messy. There were too many arguments, too much silence. But I'd thought, with time, I had finally gotten over it. Over him. When Lucas called that night, the last thing I expected was for him to ask for help. He was the one who had always been the strong one, the one who'd taken care of everything. But now, he sounded so lost, so desperate. He told me that the place he had rented had fallen through, and he had nowhere else to go. The tone in his voice, genuine, vulnerable, caught me off guard. I hesitated, but I couldn't turn him away. Not after all we had shared. After everything we had been through. I knew Daniel would be away on business for the next week. I could handle it, I told myself. It wasn't going to be for long. A few nights, tops. He would sleep in the guest room, and that would be the end of it. No harm done. When I opened the door to him, I was surprised by how much I still felt when I saw him. He hadn't changed much, at least not physically. He still had the same messy brown hair, the same crooked smile, the same eyes that seemed to know too much about me. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, though there was a slight edge to it, like he was just as nervous as I was. "Hi, Lucas," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a while." "Yeah," he nodded, his eyes scanning the hallway behind me. "I wasn't sure if you'd let me stay. But I really have no other options." I stepped aside, letting him in, the familiar smell of his cologne wafting into the house, pulling me into a past I thought I had forgotten. My heart skipped a beat. I hated myself for it. I wasn't supposed to feel anything anymore. I was married. I had a life. But there he was, standing in front of me, asking for help, as if nothing had ever changed between us. "I'll show you to the guest room," I said, my voice shaky, betraying the calm demeanor I was trying so desperately to maintain. As we walked down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps beside mine seemed too loud in the silence. I wanted to tell myself this wasn't a big deal. He was my ex. It was just one night, 2 at the most. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. When we reached the guest room, I turned to him. "Here you go. I hope it's okay. If you need anything, just let me know." "Thanks," he said quietly, his hand lingering on the doorframe. "You really didn't have to do this. But I appreciate it." I nodded, but my words caught in my throat. I couldn't shake the memory of the last time we had stood in a room together like this, before the divorce, before everything had fallen apart. The space between us felt too close. But this was different. I was married now. I had no reason to doubt myself. "Good night, Lucas," I said, forcing myself to turn away. "Sleep well." "Good night, Emma," he replied softly, and I felt the weight of those 2 words more than I should have. I walked back to the living room, my mind racing. What was I doing? letting him back into my life like this. I knew I was just being kind, just offering a place to stay. But I couldn't deny the unsettling feeling gnawing at me, like I was inviting trouble back into my life without even realizing it. I tried to distract myself by turning on the television, but nothing could pull my focus away from the thoughts swirling in my head. How could I have been so foolish to agree to this? I knew it was only temporary, but the familiarity of his presence, his voice, his laugh, the way he looked at me like no time had passed, was too much. It reminded me of who we had been, who I had been before Daniel, before everything. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I could hear Lucas moving around in the guest room, his footsteps soft but constant. The walls between us were thin, and for a moment, I wondered if he was feeling the same tension I was. But I never thought that by letting him in, I would open the door to something more dangerous than just memories. Something that could shake the foundation of everything I had built. When I finally managed to drift off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Would I still be able to hold on to my perfect life? Or had I already let the past creep back into the present, without realizing it? The days seemed to blur together after Lucas arrived. At first, I convinced myself that everything was fine, that this was just a temporary situation, and nothing would change. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Every time I passed by the guest room, I couldn't help but feel a pang in my chest, as though something was stirring beneath the surface. I wasn't sure if it was guilt, regret, or something else entirely, but whatever it was making me uneasy. The first few days were normal. Lucas kept to himself, staying mostly in his room during the day, and we only exchanged pleasantries in the evenings. It was almost like we were strangers again, and yet, there was an undeniable familiarity in the way we interacted. His laugh echoed in the house at random moments, and I would find myself smiling, remembering the days when his presence had been a comfort rather than a complication. But then, as the days wore on, things began to change. The lines between us started to blur in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. I'd catch myself looking at Lucas a little too long, my mind wandering back to our past, to the way we used to be when everything was easy, before the marriage fell apart. There was something in the way he smiled at me, a knowing look in his eyes that made my stomach twist. One evening, after dinner, we sat together on the couch in the living room. Daniel had been away on business for a few days, and the house felt quieter, emptier without him. It was just Lucas and me, like it used to be, and for a brief moment, it felt like nothing had changed. "So," Lucas said, breaking the silence, "how's life been treating you? You know, since everything." I could tell he was trying to sound casual, but there was a hint of something more beneath his words. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else. "It's been good," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm happy with Daniel. He's great." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving me. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve it." His words were sincere, but something about the way he said them felt heavier than it should have. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "And what about you?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable silence. "How's everything going with you? Are you settling in okay?" He chuckled softly. "Yeah, it's been fine. I mean, I didn't expect to be staying here for this long, but I appreciate you letting me stay. It's been nice." I nodded, forcing my smile to stay in place, but inside, my mind was racing. His words were innocent enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to gauge something deeper than just small talk. I was starting to realize how much I still cared about him, how much I still missed him. And that terrified me. Over the next few days, Lucas and I began spending more time together. We would talk late into the night, reminiscing about old times. The conversations came easily, almost too easily. It was like we had never been apart, like nothing had changed between us. We laughed at the same jokes, shared stories that only the two of us would understand. At times, I even caught myself forgetting that I was married, that I had a life with Daniel outside of the strange, nostalgic space I was creating with Lucas. One afternoon, after lunch, we went for a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. As we walked side by side, I felt the old chemistry between us return. The way his hand brushed against mine, the way his voice sounded when he spoke, everything about him felt familiar and comforting in a way that I hadn't realized I missed. "It's funny," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "I never thought I'd be back here, walking down these streets again." "Yeah, me neither," I replied softly. "A lot's changed, hasn't it?" He nodded, his eyes flicking toward me. "Yeah, but some things haven't, have they?" The look in his eyes made my heart race, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the words he said, but the way he said them. It was like he was drawing me into something I wasn't sure I wanted to be a part of. I quickly looked away, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this way about him anymore. I had moved on. I had Daniel. But Lucas, he had always known how to make me feel things, how to make me remember the good, the bad, the everything. When we returned to the house, I excused myself to go upstairs. I needed space to think. I needed to put distance between us, to clear my mind. But it was hard. It was so hard. Every time I walked past the guest room, I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though something inside me was calling me back to the past. That night, after dinner, Lucas came into the living room and sat next to me. We were watching a movie, but I couldn't focus on the screen. Every time I glanced at him, my heart skipped a beat. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and soft. I nodded quickly, trying to hide the turmoil inside me. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You sure?" His eyes searched mine, as if trying to see through the facade I was desperately trying to keep intact. "You seem distant." I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. He was right. I was distant. I was pulling away, but not from him. From myself. "I'm just tired," I muttered, looking away. "Long day." He didn't say anything more after that. Instead, he leaned back on the couch, and we continued watching the movie in silence. But the tension between us was palpable. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and I could feel myself slipping, losing my grip on what I knew was right. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened. The way Lucas made me feel, how familiar, how safe it was to be around him. And how wrong that was. I had Daniel. I had a life. But why did it feel like I was betraying that life with every passing day? I couldn't keep doing this. I had to stop before it went too far. But a small voice inside me whispered that it might already be too late. The following week, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It had been building for days, this sense of impending change, of something shifting that I couldn't control. I kept telling myself that I had to keep my distance from Lucas. But every time he was around, it was as if I couldn't stop myself from slipping back into the rhythm of our old relationship. Daniel was still away for work, and although I tried to distract myself with various household tasks, my thoughts kept returning to Lucas. The way he had looked at me that day, his eyes filled with that unspoken understanding, kept replaying in my mind. I tried to push it aside, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. One evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Lucas walked in. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me for a moment before speaking. "Hey," he said softly. "Can we talk?" His voice had an unfamiliar calm to it, one that made me stop what I was doing and turn to face him. "About what?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," he said, taking a step toward me. I think we need to talk about us." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Us?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "About everything. About how things are between us now." I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Lucas, we can't do this," I said quickly, turning away from him to focus on the stove, though I knew it was futile. I could feel his presence behind me, his eyes on me, and I couldn't pretend like nothing was happening anymore. "You don't have to pretend," Lucas said, his voice softer now. "I know things have changed. I can feel it too. But I don't want to keep ignoring it." I was silent, unsure of how to respond. Every word he said felt like a tug on the thread that was slowly unraveling inside me. "We've both moved on," I finally said, trying to make my voice sound more convincing than I felt. "You're here temporarily. And I'm with Daniel now." Lucas didn't answer immediately, but when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I know you're with him. But that doesn't mean you stopped caring about me. Did you?" The question was so simple, yet it shook me to my core. I didn't know how to answer. I hadn't stopped caring about Lucas, how could I? We had been everything to each other once. But the reality was, I was married now, and I couldn't afford to let my feelings for Lucas resurface. I didn't know if I even had the strength to fight them. I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This is complicated." "Yeah," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness I hadn't heard in a long time. "But sometimes, complicated is worth figuring out." I could feel him standing too close now, and my heart was racing. I needed to put some space between us, to remind myself of where I was, of who I was supposed to be with. But when I looked up at him, I saw the same longing in his eyes that I had been trying to ignore for days. And in that moment, it was so much harder to resist. "I can't do this," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "I can't betray Daniel like this." Lucas reached out then, placing a hand gently on my arm. The warmth of his touch sent a shock through me, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. "Maybe we're not betraying anyone," he said softly. "Maybe we're just finally being honest with ourselves." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that this couldn't happen. But there was a part of me, a dangerous part, that wanted to believe him. To believe that this wasn't a mistake. That what we had, what we could have again, was worth risking everything for. Before I could respond, I heard the front door open, and Daniel's voice called out from the hallway. "Hey, I'm home," he said, his voice full of cheer. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was enough to snap me out of my trance. I pulled away from Lucas quickly, my heart pounding as I rushed to greet Daniel. "Hey, babe," I said, trying to sound normal, even though my mind was racing. "How was your trip?" "It was good, but I missed you," Daniel said, pulling me into a hug. "I've got a surprise for you." I forced a smile, trying to push the heaviness that had settled in my chest away. "What is it?" "Something I know you've been wanting," he said, grinning. "But you'll have to wait until tomorrow to find out." I laughed, grateful for the distraction, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas. As Daniel and I moved into the living room to catch up, I found it impossible to ignore the tension that still lingered between me and my ex. It was as though we had just shared a moment, an unspoken understanding that couldn't be erased so easily. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept circling back to what Lucas had said, to the way he had looked at me. He was right. Things had changed. The lines between us had blurred, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I had moved on, a part of me was still stuck in the past. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about Lucas. The way he made me feel when we were together, how I could still feel the pull of what we once had even now. It was dangerous, and I knew it. But in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The door to the guest room creaked open, and I heard Lucas's footsteps in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew I was at a crossroads. I could either let this moment slip away or give in to what I was feeling. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to walk away anymore. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the thoughts racing through my mind, but the pull of what might be, what could be, was too strong. And I knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. The days that followed felt like I was living in two separate realities. With Daniel, I went through the motions of normal life, laughing at jokes, planning dinners, and talking about our future. But every time I looked at Lucas, it felt as though the walls around me were crumbling. It wasn't just the lingering tension between us, it was the rawness of old emotions, things I thought I had buried deep inside. I tried so hard to pretend that everything was fine, that I could separate the life I had with Daniel from the history I shared with Lucas. But the more time went on, the harder it became. One night, when Daniel was out with friends, I found myself standing in the hallway of our house, staring at the door to the guest room. It was late, much later than I should have been awake. But sleep had become impossible. I felt restless, caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep my distance from Lucas, to stay loyal to Daniel, but a voice deep inside me whispered that I couldn't ignore what was happening between us any longer. I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching, and I froze. Lucas appeared at the end of the hallway, his silhouette just visible in the dim light of the living room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if the air around us had thickened, charged with unspoken words, emotions that had been building up for weeks. "I'm sorry," Lucas finally said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to make things harder. I can't stop thinking about us." The words hit me like a punch in the chest. I had known he was struggling, that he was still caught up in the past, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. And it made it harder for me to deny what was happening inside me. "You don't have to apologize," I said, forcing the words out, even though they felt like lies. "It's just complicated. I'm married now, Lucas. I can't keep doing this." "I know," he said softly. "But it's not about what we were before. It's about what we are now. The way things feel when we're together. I can't ignore that, and I don't think you can either." The raw honesty in his voice shattered the fragile control I had been clinging to. I felt my heart race, the pull between us growing stronger with every word he spoke. For a moment, I stood there, unable to find the words to respond. My mind screamed at me to stop, to tell him to leave, to tell him I was committed to Daniel. But my body betrayed me, and I found myself stepping closer to him instead. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away from this." Lucas took a step forward, closing the gap between us. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't name: desire, desperation, hope. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said quietly. But I can't pretend like nothing's happening between us. We both feel it. And I think we both know that this isn't something we can just walk away from. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, everything inside me wanted to surrender to the pull of what we had shared. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to fall into something I wasn't sure I could survive. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to resist. Then, without thinking, I did something I had been fighting against for so long. I reached out and touched his arm, just a light touch, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. The moment my skin made contact with his, everything seemed to stop. I could feel his heartbeat, the warmth of his body, and in that moment, everything else faded into the background. Lucas didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand gently cupping my face. The world outside of that moment seemed to disappear, and all that mattered was the connection between us. I knew what I was doing, knew the consequences, but in that instant, I didn't care. I was so tired of fighting it, tired of pretending I wasn't still in love with him. Before I could stop myself, I kissed him. It was a slow, hesitant kiss at first, but the moment our lips met, everything I had been holding back for so long came rushing forward. It felt like a release, like all the pain, all the confusion, and all the longing I had been carrying for months had finally found its outlet. For a few minutes, it was just the two of us, nothing else mattered. It was as though time stood still, and all that existed was the electricity between us. But reality came crashing back when I heard a car door slam outside. My heart stopped, and I pulled away from him quickly, panic rising in my chest. "Someone's here," I whispered, my breath ragged. "Daniel, he's home." Lucas looked at me with a mixture of frustration and longing. "I shouldn't have kissed you," he said, shaking his head. "I never meant to put you in this position." I could see the guilt written all over his face, but I couldn't deny what had just happened. The kiss had changed everything. It had opened a door that I couldn't close again, no matter how hard I tried. I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing control." "You don't have to make any decisions right now," Lucas said softly. "But you need to be honest with yourself. And with Daniel. Whatever happens next, you can't keep pretending that this isn't real." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. "I know," I said quietly. "I know." I heard the sound of the front door closing, followed by footsteps approaching the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew that everything was about to change. There was no going back now. As Daniel appeared in the doorway, his smile faded when he saw the tension between me and Lucas. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was caught in a web of lies, of emotions I didn't understand, and I had no idea how to untangle myself from it all. The truth was, I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep pretending any longer. The web I had woven for myself was unraveling, and I had no idea where it would lead. I ask everyone who likes our content to subscribe to the channel. It will help us a lot, and it will be a pleasure to have you here with us.